The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild released in 2017 to critical acclaim. Players everywhere were excited to get their hands on this brand new Zelda experience. The launch of a Zelda game is always a major event, except this Zelda game was not like any other that came before it. This time around, the team wanted to set themselves free of any conventions the series had accumulated over the years, and took a step back to re-examine the formula and cut whatever they deemed unnecessary. No more dungeon items, small keys, or dungeon maps, no more hookshot, no more heart pickups, no more rolling, no more auto jump. The list goes on. Now, this decision was met with a lot of controversy, of course, as any series would when going through such a massive fundamental change, especially a series as massive and influential as Zelda. Lots of people adored these aspects and were disappointed to see them gone in the newest entry. However, in my opinion, the series was really in need of a shakeup. Skyward Sword, the most recent mainline 3D title before Breath of the Wild, was the 5th game to use the tried and true 3D Zelda formula, and those games spanned a whopping 13 years. The formula, while great, was definitely starting to stale up a bit. When Ocarina of Time first hit the scene in 1998, it redefined what a video game could be. It was truly revolutionary. Ocarina of Time was the first game to establish the 3D Zelda formula, in which most games that came after it followed closely. They'd all, except Majora's Mask, start with Link waking up just as a boy in his little village, before he gets thrust into a grand adventure. They all consisted of a handful of dungeons, in which you adventure in, find the special dungeon item, use said item to make your way through the rest of the dungeon, find the boss, open up its very specific weakness with said dungeon item, wail on it a bit, grab your heart container, and bam, next. Dungeons were also restricted in order. You always had to hit the Great Deku Tree first, then Dodongo's Cavern, and so on. Some games played around with slightly different formats, like the Wind Waker's pseudo-open world with the Great Sea, but the core format had remained unchanged. Breath of the Wild sought to change this. Dungeons in any order, a giant unrestricted open world, scavenging, cooking, breakable weapons, actual attack and defense stats, armor that completely changes your appearance, a jump button! It was the most fundamentally different Zelda game, probably since Zelda 2 on the NES, and critics and fans loved it. Zelda craze was at an all-time high in 2017. The game was basically carrying the launch of the Nintendo Switch all by itself, because what, people bought this thing for 1-2 Switch? Everyone wanted to try their hand at this brand new Zelda experience, but I would be lying if I said that no Zelda fans felt disappointed in the new game, as perhaps the thing they loved the most about these games was destroyed in the convention-burning fire that was Breath of the Wild. Many felt like it was too different to even be called a Zelda game. A shame, but I believe trimming the fat like that was exactly what let the team focus on making sure this brand new formula is tuned exactly the way they want. But enough rambling. Let's fast forward to June 2019. E3 is here. Banjo and Hero just got announced for Smash, we saw more of Luigi's Mansion 3, Pokemon Sword and Shield I am legally required to omit my opinion for, and we got the first ever look at the sequel to Breath of the Wild. It looked dark, it looked spooky. Is that Ganondorf? What's this weird gooby stuff? Is it Malice? What's this weird hand? Look at Zelda's hair! Is this underground? They went silent for 2 years. We had been left wondering and theorizing for 2 years, and even after E3 2021, where we got our first footage of the game since the reveal, we still know almost nothing, and that trailer was so short it gave us more questions than answers. Yeah, it's been way too long. I mean, at the time of this recording, we don't even know what this game is actually called. We've just been calling it Breath of the Wild 2, because nobody is gonna keep saying the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild every time. Now, this may age horribly, as currently, at the time of this recording, we're in Nintendo Direct season, but I digress. In the horrible, horrible silence that has been the last 3 years, I've had a lot of time to think about the direction I'd like to see the team take this game. And in my thoughts, I've always come back to the idea that I want to see a lot of those conventions that we all know and love reintroduced in a brand new way to fit this style. Could it be done? I think it could. But what should be chosen to make its triumphant return, and what should be left on the chopping block? Ocarina of Time had Link control his environment and warp him to different places via the magical titular Ocarina of Time. Since then, we've seen Link play a variety of other magical instruments, including bongos, a guitar, a harp, a conductor's wand, howling at rocks, grass. Yeah, Twilight Princess broke this trend a little, but the point is that magical instruments that do cool stuff has been a big part of the series' identity for a long time. And that's not even considering the countless times instruments were important to the 2D games. It was kind of a shame to not see one in Breath of the Wild. However, I think this mechanic can fit in extremely well with Breath of the Wild's new open format. The game already essentially gives you a giant open world, and a bunch of tools for screwing around with it via the runes. So having a magical instrument that could provide other ways of tinkering and playing with the environment around you just makes perfect sense. There could be secrets and hidden goodies scattered all over the map that you need to play songs to access. It's the exact kind of versatile tool that the other runes are. This instrument could even be one of your runes. I think being able to summon a thunderstorm or clear the weather at will is a little broken, so its powers would have to be toned back in a way that can fit the game's overall progression and balance, but I think it's an excellent idea. As for what instrument Link could play, I think a woodwind type of instrument would be perfect. I mean, assuming the game still has breath in the title anyway. I think a flute would be a really nice choice, as not only does it fit the vibe of Breath of the Wild, it could also be an awesome callback to the flute from the very first NES Zelda game, a game that inspired this brand new direction in the first place. Another thing that has always been at the very core of the Zelda series, much more so than magical instruments, is dungeons. Dungeons were what Zelda was famous for, and they're what so many people love most about the series. That's why it was understandable that so many people were extremely disappointed in Breath of the Wild's dungeon offerings. From the core, Breath of the Wild takes a very different approach to dungeons than what we're used to. Instead of having a dozen large-scale, different themed, sprawling dungeons, we're now given 4 visually similar dungeons, the Divine Beasts, and 120 mini-dungeons, the Shrines. Now, I think the Shrines were a perfect idea for the vastness of Breath of the Wild. They're bite-sized, fun, creative, and help break up the pacing of all that exploring. We spend a lot more time in the overworld of Breath of the Wild than in any other 3D Zelda. I'd even argue that some 3D Zelda overworlds just feel like a space that serves little purpose other than to connect dungeons together. So, I very much appreciate the change of pace. However, I think what was a little lacking in Breath of the Wild were the game's main dungeons, the Divine Beasts. Don't get me wrong, in concepts, these are extremely cool. Giant, ancient mechanical beasts doubling as full dungeons inside where you can manipulate each one in a unique way to solve puzzles and traverse it? That's insanely cool. The execution, though, leaves a bit to be desired. All 4 beasts use the same beige-brown color scheme, the same 1 or 2 enemy types, similar music, similar looking goopy Ganon bosses, and while each one was definitely fun and enjoyable, they're all over pretty quick. In a game filled with tons and tons of micro-dungeons, I really wanted these to provide a more substantial and robust dungeoning experience. And while obviously more substantial than Shrines, still doesn't stack up to the series' dungeon history in my opinion. This is why I hope the sequel taps into a little bit more of that previous Zelda dungeon formula, to give us a bit more than what the Divine Beasts offered. I'd love to see the return of completely unique themes, mini-bosses and bosses, enemy variety, and just larger scope and scale in general. Though, I still would like these to be optional, just as the Divine Beasts were, since I think it's also important to maintain the freedom of choice present in Breath of the Wild. Just no water temple, please. In Breath of the Wild, combat got a massive overhaul from the previous 3D games. Gone were the fairly simple but fun encounters of the previous games. This game completely changed how Zelda combat works, and in my opinion, it was for the better. The insane flexibility you have to defeat enemies in so many different ways is incredible. You can walk up and swing your sword, sit back and use your bow, plant and detonate explosives, summon a lightning bolt, whack them with a giant metal crate. It's extremely impressive what the team was able to do here with the combat, and how it perfectly embodies what Breath of the Wild is ultimately about. The freedom of player choice, and the open-endedness that lets you find your own solution. Perfect dodges and bullet time sequences make combat feel insanely rewarding and fun, especially when stacking your skills up to the best of the best, like Lionel's. However, the previous 3D Zelda games had a flashiness to them that I think is missing in Breath of the Wild. This is why I think it would be great if we gave Link a more diverse moveset, and tapped into some of those previous skills and moves he had in the previous games. Rolling around to the back of your enemy and slashing, the insanely satisfying final blows, and overall variety of physical moves Link could pull off. Swordplay in Breath of the Wild is fairly simple. Link has a basic attack and a charge attack for each of the 3 different weapon archetypes: one-handed, two-handed, and spears and lances. This would also play into Link's moveset, giving him different cool finishing moves and special actions unique to each weapon type. Combining a more extensive moveset with the already vast amount of freedom Breath of the Wild's combat offers, I think would result in an even more rewarding and fun experience. At the end of the day, I think adding some of these things back into the sequel in a reworked and reformatted way would not only enhance the gameplay, but just maybe win some of those veteran Zelda fans back, the ones who were disappointed with the direction Breath of the Wild took this series. Zelda is a very important franchise to a lot of people, including me, and it's important to the industry as a whole. I know a lot of people were upset to see the series' identity change over the last 5 years, and while I still think Breath of the Wild's radically different approach was necessary to shake up the series, I think now is a great time to start bringing back these ideas and conventions in a brand new way. Breath of the Wild is still a phenomenal game, and I'm clearly not the only one who thinks this. By the time you're watching this, we may very well know exactly what Breath of the Wild 2 is, and even what it's called, but I personally cannot wait to see what the team has been cooking up for the last 3 years. Regardless if they decide to bring these conventions back or not, I have a feeling the game will be great regardless.